Okay, hi again. So welcome to the fourth part of our lecture series on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. This will be the fourth and final part of this presentation, and we will assume that folks watching this have knowledge of what was covered in the first three parts. So if you're inclined, a complete presentation would you please review parts 1, 2, and 3 of this video lecture. Okay, so this is part 4, and again the final part. And in this section we'll be covering again, if you remember in the first section we covered economic growth in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. We'll be revisiting that idea of economic growth within the context of these two ideas here, particularly the invisible hand, which everybody knows Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? That's what everybody gets, and we'll get to it at the end of this lecture, sort of wrap it up. And then we'll also be talking about productive and unproductive labor, and sort of Smith's explanation of capital accumulation, which I think is really interesting. The economic growth stuff that we covered in section 1, I think is really clever, right? And I think that the way Smith handles this idea of capital accumulation is also pretty clever. So I kind of enjoy, everybody knows I like Smith in general, right? But kind of like this one more than even other ones. All right, so let's hop right into it. So, just to quickly reiterate, right, we don't want to take a huge amount of time with this, but the sort of economic growth story in Smith covered in depth in the first part of this lecture. The story of economic growth goes like this. So there's some kind of expansion of the market, right? So, that could be some technology is developed that allows us to travel further than before, or just more people, right? You could just have more people. And that leads to increased division of labor and specialization, because the market's now broader. It can essentially bear or manage a greater specialization of labor. And that specialization in turn brings increases in productivity, and increases in productivity bring about increases in real wealth. And of course that real wealth, that's economic growth, right? The Smithian model. So this is sort of the story, right? This is the whole of part 1. But of course there's a lot left out of that process. So we talked about like increasing productivity and things like that. Machinery doesn't just pop into existence, right? Capital doesn't just accumulate. I mean, heck, if it did, squirrels would become richer every year, right? There's something more to it than that. So what is it? Well, as we mentioned again in the first section, Smith points to sort of learning by doing effects. Sort of workers, as they become more and more specialized, they get better and better at their job, and that includes developing better production techniques and developing productivity enhancing technology. So that's part of the story here, and it's not a part that we want to forget about, but it's not the whole of the story. Now, before we dig in any further into that explanation, or really Smith's explanation of that story, we need to talk a little bit about this idea called the capital stock. Now, Smith refers to that term, capital stock, and all subsequent economists up to the current day will refer to the capital stock. Now, if you took Econ 304, Intermediate Macroeconomics, and you learned about sort of solo growth modeling, which is just Smith, by the way. So if you're walking through this at the end of this presentation, you say like, oh, sounds a lot like solo. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so it is. I would argue that Smith actually did it way better than Solo did it, but we'll leave it there for now. You can discuss amongst yourselves, right? Okay, so all economists talk about the capital stock, right? Including Smith. What is the capital stock, right? In the solo growth model, it's K, uppercase K. Smith, it's sort of, this is kind of how he lays it out. So, the total quantity of machinery, technology, and knowledge that can be applied to the production process. So that's something that hopefully is fairly clear in the abstract, right? If we can imagine like all the machinery and all the equipment and all the smarts, right, needed to produce things. Add it all up, and that's the capital stock. Now, to try to arrive at a number for the capital stock, which would be needed to measure it year in, year out, right, as we saw in the third part, we talked about measurement. Well, then you need something more concrete than just sort of that abstract idea. Now, you should know that that's quite a big discussion, right? And there is a serious literature within economics on exactly what the capital stock is and how you would go about measuring it. And there are, of course, there's no right answer for that, right? So you sort of just get answers that are less wrong, right, over time. But suffice it to say that we have the luxury in here of talking about the capital stock in the abstract. And so that's what I mean by that. Okay, let's move on. This is sort of monkey with the typewriter here, because there's one thing I want to remind me, right, to talk about one thing here, right? So I want you to I mentioned this a moment ago, but I want you to understand that when we talk about capital stock, we're not just talking about concrete things, right? We're talking about the knowledge and ability to use that capital stock. Okay, so like the monkey with a typewriter meme thing is always funny because, of course, monkeys don't know how to use typewriters, right? But if we think about the capital of typewriter, right, which allows us to write more quickly, it's typing, that's why we do it, right? It's way more faster than writing by hand. So we have the typewriter there, right, in the left panel, right? And that's part of the equation. Yeah, this doorbell. And then in the right-hand panel, of course, we have the monkey, right? And the monkey has to know how to use the typewriter for the typewriter to function. Okay. All right, I was hoping somebody gets the door, right? No. All right, good. Somebody got the door finally. Okay, so you got to have the typewriter and you have to have the monkey, right? And it's a combination of those two things that produces, that allows for productivity, right? Without that, you don't have that productivity. All right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pause it here, and we're going to come back after I deal with this situation. All right, and we're back. I know. Did you miss me? No. Okay, we were just talking about monkeys and typewriters, right? Yeah. So, when we talk about capital stock, it's really it's a complicated problem, right? Because as I mentioned, for the typewriter on its own does not contribute to productivity. Try it sometime. Put a typewriter out in your backyard, or typewriter, right? A typewriter. What are you talking about? Take your tablet, put it on your desk or something like that. Just let it sit there and see if your homework assignment gets done. Right? Of course, it's not going to get done, right? You have to have the technology, and you also have to have the know-how, right? It's the combination of those two that makes both your knowledge productive and the technology, the sort of hard artifact of the technology, productive as well, right? So it is a really tricky concept, right? And I want you to keep that idea in your mind, right? Because of course we're going to be talking about how does that capital accumulate over time, right? Because that's going to be critical to economic growth. Okay. So we want to think about how does capital accumulate over time? Does it accumulate in a linear fashion? Does it occur in sort of a increasing at a decreasing rate? So on. There's a lot of possibilities, right? Smith, in talking about capital accumulation, breaks the idea down into productive versus unproductive labor. And those terms of productive and unproductive may not be entirely appropriate given the modern usages of those words, but hopefully we can clarify what Smith means by this. And I think you'll see that he means something it's really a very interesting idea, and one that has a lot of tendrils, and it sort of creeps into a lot of economic organization. So in Smith, productive labor refers to allocation or usages of labor that somehow contribute to growth in the capital stock, whereas unproductive labor only contributes to current consumption. Okay, so it doesn't really mean that one is good and one is bad, right? It means exactly that. Productive labor contributes to the capital growth in the capital stock, and unproductive labor does not. End of story. Okay, so wipe away all sort of other expectations about those words, except that. At one path, productive labor does this, unproductive labor does that. All right. Okay, so some examples here. So I gave this example of I'm going to use the evening. So this evening when I'm done with work, maybe I'm going to learn a new software platform. In the case, that's productive labor, right? Whereas if I set up a party for tomorrow or something like that tomorrow, and I have to picture the party here, right? If I set up a party, that it's going to be fun. I'm sure everybody's going to have a good time, but it's not going to contribute to my personal capital stock or the capital stock of the nation. And so the idea of productive and unproductive, right, is really how we think of it in modern economics, but it's probably how your mom meant it when she told you when you were a kid, go use your time more productively. Right? Or something like that. Maybe you're playing video games or something like that. So that would correspond nicely to Smith's productive and unproductive labor. She wanted to go read a book or something like that, right? Like, go read a book, stop goofing off there. I know I'm a parent nowadays, right? I tell my kids that stuff all the time. And that's what Smith's talking about, right? That's what he's getting at. Okay, so productive labor is labor that's somehow going to contribute to a better future, right? So unproductive labor might be a lot of fun right now, right? But isn't going to contribute to that more productive future. Okay, so let's for a little while now turn this discussion to thinking about sort of modern macroeconomics, because I've said it before, right? It's important we connect this stuff with what we do today as economists. But if we think about it in modern terms, which is dangerous to do because Smith is talking in these generalities, remember capital stock and how hard that is? And he's also talking in exclusively real terms, right? So he's talking about stuff. When he talks about capital stock, he's talking about these abstract knowledge and concrete machinery and so on and so forth. He's not talking about money. He's not talking about the amount of nominal resources available in the bank. No, not at all. He's not talking about a pile of gold somewhere like the mercantilists are. No, not at all. He's talking about real stuff. And of course, when we do modern macroeconomics, we almost exclusively work in nominal terms, and then we proxy back to the real, right? Which is what part 2 of this lecture was about. So hopefully we're clear on that, right? So it's dangerous to move into these sort of quasi-real terminology, but let's just do it, just so you can kind of see how it hooks up to modern macroeconomics, even though it's precarious. This distinction that we're talking about here between productive and unproductive labor is a lot like the idea of consumption and investment. And remember from your macro, C plus I plus G plus NX, right? Okay. So when we're talking about consumption, we're talking about expenditures of the household. On what? On goods and services. We're talking about investment spending, we're talking about spending by business. On what? On machinery, equipment, and so on and so forth. Those are sort of the generic EC 104 definitions that you find in your book. But that really doesn't do either idea justice. Because in both cases, we're using item ups, right? Whether we're consumption spending or investment spending, we are using stuff up. And we are utilizing labor while doing that, as well as other factors of production. But let's just stick with labor now to keep it simple. Okay? So let's think of an example to illustrate how these two ideas, C and I, are seemingly very different, but not really, okay? And then also how they're very similar to Smith's idea of productive and unproductive labor, as well as the process of capital accumulation, because all these ideas hang together really nicely. Okay, so let's say we work. So here's the example right here, so you can read it. Right, you can listen to me yak about it and read it as well. Right. So let's say Monday through Thursday we go to work, and it's a 10-day cycle. So the first 9 days we go to work and we make 10 pizzas each day. Right. Okay. And then at the end of the day, we take home 9 of those pizzas, to eat for dinner, share with our family, and then eat for breakfast the next morning. I know you think pizza diet, great, Kev. Whatever, it's simple, bear with me. Okay, so we eat 9 pizzas. In macroeconomics, we would call that process of eating 9 pizzas modern macroeconomics. Now we call it consumption spending. So whatever we paid for those pizzas would be the nominal expenditure, right? But it would reflect the real consumption spending of 9 pizzas. And if you're thinking like, oh yeah, because I'm consuming pizzas, now it's consumption. Okay, right, that's right. When you tear everything back, like a lot of economic terminology starts to make way more sense than it does, when you just learn it at the level it's presented in most introductory textbooks. And it often doesn't make investments the same way, right? How many of you had a hard time like with investment questions when you're in EC 104? It's the number one question my 104 kids miss. They can't understand investment. They just can't understand it. They think, I bought stocks and bonds, so I was investing. It's not investment. Not the way economists think about it. It's not the way Smith is talking about it. So anyway, back to our story. We make 10 pizzas every day. Every day we bring 9 of them home and we eat them, and then we leave one, at the shop, maybe put it in the fridge so it stays good, right? And then on the 10th day, instead of going in and making pizzas, all of us pizza workers sit down at a table and we talk about how we're going to make pizzas better in the future. And while we're doing that, we've got to eat pizza. So we eat up those pizzas that we put in the fridge throughout the last 9 days. So we have a stock of production that is currently unconsumed that we can eat while we're thinking about making better pizzas. Okay, in modern macroeconomics, we would call those pizzas we ate while thinking about better pizzas to be what? Investment spending. Okay, so when we look at the variable I in modern macroeconomics and we look at those nominal values that we get, and we try to proxy them back to real values, what are we trying to get at? We're trying to get at the stock of stuff that was used up or utilized or brought to bear on the production process. Okay, now let's take it a step further back to Smith. When we ate those pizzas, when we were just chilling at home, the labor needed to produce those pizzas was unproductive labor. The labor when we were making the pizzas that we were going to eat on the day when we're thinking about making better pizzas, that is productive labor. So even though we're making pizzas, it's all we're making, right? It's all we're making. Sometimes that labor is productive and sometimes it's unproductive, depending upon how that product is utilized with respect to future production. Okay, really important ideas. Okay, really important ideas for an economist to understand. Maybe the most important. Okay. So now this brings us to a question, right? If productive labor leads to capital accumulation, and if capital accumulation aids in increasing productivity, and of course productivity is real wealth, right? Then shouldn't we just encourage people to be more productive all the time, right? Like your mom, right? She's like, go be more productive. Stop playing video games. Go pick up a book and learn something. Darn it. Should we maybe force people to do that, right? Because then we could probably, almost certainly increase economic growth, right? Could hasten the speed of economic growth. Force people to engage in more productive labor. Well, there's a couple questions there. The first question goes back to something I said a little while ago, which is why I've got this picture here again. If capital accumulates at an increasing but decreasing rate, like the graph there in the top middle, then the more we try to be productive, the less and less bang we get for our buck, right? And that's of course a problem, right? Because if we assume that what we're giving up, even it occurs at a constant rate, then there's some point where we should stop giving that thing up, right? It could be that capital accumulates in sort of a skip and jump sort of way, maybe like the graph there in the bottom middle, right? We don't really know how capital accumulates, and so it's difficult to say that we could get huge gains with sort of modest adjustments to so-called unproductive and productive labor, or reallocations of labor effort towards things that we would expect would increase capital accumulation. Now, if we were a developing economy in the developed world, chances are probably a little better we could get it right, because we could follow the paths of capital accumulation of more developed countries. But if we're trying to say move from being a developed status to compared to other countries to a more developed status, it becomes far more questionable whether we'll be able to choose the right path. And keep that in mind, right? We're going to come back to that idea. But for most countries, especially ones that are sort of behind, right, that's pretty likely that they'll be able to do that. But that leads us to the second problem here, the sort of second dilemma of this question of, well, should we just force more productive labor or not? Well, what's the point of an economy, right? Is the point of an economy for everybody to get materially richer all the time, always? Or is the point of an economy for us to have a reasonable material standard of living? It's an important question, right? For example, when's the right time for me to stop working and to take it easy? When's the right time for you to do that? Because of course there's a benefit from not being productive, right? There's a benefit to being unproductive. And, if we forego that all the time, we potentially lose a lot of meaning from our lives. Okay? So, going back to the idea of productive and unproductive, I said at the beginning it's not necessarily good or bad, right? They're two different things, right? And so we should understand that movement in one direction is likely to hasten economic growth, but we should also understand that there's something that we will give up by doing so. That there's a cost and a benefit of those choices. Okay? Now, let's try to dig in a little further. Well, for us as individuals, it's probably, for most of us, the case that we'd probably be a little better off if we engaged in, if we're a little more productive with our labor than unproductive. Certainly I know whenever I'm, goofing around or something like that, I recognize, like, geez, how much could I have learned? I could have learned that GIS software that I've been saying I'm going to learn for the last 6 months or whatever. I could have got a good start on that, or, my gosh, I could have learned some statistical techniques that might help me out on a paper that I'm working on or something, rather than watching these reruns on TV or, junk on YouTube. But, sometimes you just have to chill out and take a break. But of course you should be cognizant of what you're giving up. But when we talk about that on a social level, what right do I have to choose for you about how productive you should be? What right does the government have, say the city of Eau Claire or the state of Wisconsin or the United States federal government, or the government, if you live somewhere else, the government where you live, what right do they have to tell you what's the correct use of your labor? It becomes very tricky. Now, if they're going to tell you that you should change your allocation of labor so that they can get richer, well, that's almost certainly unethical now, isn't it? Okay, but what in a situation right now? Should the government force businesses to drop what they're doing and get to work on COVID-19 stuff? That's one of the questions before us, right? So you might have heard people say, like, well, why doesn't the president create, sort of wartime production board, which is how World War II worked, right? So we told, and sort of the history books say, like, okay, well, Ford just voluntarily stopped producing Fords and made Jeeps, and everybody was in it for the war effort during World War II. That's not really true. What happened is the federal government had to go to companies like Chrysler, Ford, Boeing, so on and so forth, and say, like, look, you're not making this stuff anymore. You're now making war stuff, and that's it. And if you don't, we're confiscating that output. So it was quite severe, right? Again, you sort of present it as like this sort of happy story, but you're asking those businesses to give up a lot and to do a lot for that national effort of World War II, and similarly now, certainly it's the case. It's within the power of the federal government, since we have an emergency situation, to redirect productive resources towards the solution of the COVID-19 problem. And I think the ethics there are much more muddled than they are in any of my previous examples. Right? There's potentially lives on the line, and potentially many lives on the line. In that scenario, is it right as a society to redirect production in ways that are going to enhance the capital stock, and in this case, particularly the capital stock with respect to fighting diseases? Okay, so you see, it's a tricky issue. Moreover, who should get vaccines first when they're invented? Right now, we've said that, what are they calling it? Critical labor or something like that. Anyway, I'm one of those now. Teachers, we got on the, and professors too. If they remembered professors for a change, usually we get forgotten as educators, but they remember us. Essential labor, right? We're essential labor. Now, what makes for essential labor? Essential labor, if you go and look at the guidelines for essential labor are the ones who keep the machines going, right? And so originally teachers weren't on that list, and then they figured out, like, oh yeah, kids, right? And if the kids are at home, right, then the workers can't keep the machines going. So now teachers are on too, right? So essential workers are not completely analogous to Smith's idea of productive labor, but they're certainly along the same lines of thinking. Non-essential labor, the opposite. If you're working in a restaurant, you're non-essential labor, right, by today's definition. And unless you're all your clientele are workers at the factory across the street or something like that, so therefore you're putting food in the bellies of the people, right? Okay, if you're working at a high-end restaurant or something like that, almost certainly would be classified under Smith's schema as unproductive labor. Does it mean you're bad? No. But it means that you're not contributing to the growth in the capital stock of the nation. Okay? So, should you be redirected to fight COVID-19? Okay. In case you haven't guessed, I know this is going a little long, and I apologize for that, but it's an important discussion. I think for most of you, if not even all of you watching this is maybe the first time you ever heard these things, right? But the idea that we can just redirect production, right, and that we even think about this type of production versus that type of production, and think in a meaningful way about capital accumulation or anything like that. But these are the economic questions, right? There are simply no more important economic questions than effective economic growth and capital accumulation. That is the question, right? And so it really should always be at a minimal at the back of our minds, if not at the front of our minds as economists. Okay, enough of my soapbox. Let's move on. So in the last several slides, I've been talking about sort of forced or redirected production, right? Well, Smith has more to say about this, right? So Smith is no dummy. He understands the implications of what he's saying when he's saying it. Back in 1706, he would have understood perfectly everything that I was just talking about. He would have recognized the perils of the stuff I was talking about. Essentially everything, he recognized this. And so for questions of economic organization, Smith's answer is this invisible hand idea, right? So here's the quote here. Invisible hand, actually, it's Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is like 800 pages long or whatever. It's long, right? It's actually, let's see if I can see it on this. That's it right there. Right above my finger is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So you can see it's a pretty big book relative to all the other books I have there. And he only mentions the invisible hand twice in the whole book. So it's not like it's scattered throughout, right? This is the first time here. And the thinking is with this, but it's a powerful analogy, right? And actually, well, now there's a whole story of where he actually got the idea from and all that. But ask if you see me at the bar or something sometime, you can ask me and we'll talk about it then. And that's never going to happen, right? Okay, but whatever, right? So the thinking the invisible hand is that, if everybody pursues their own self-interest, right? So if I decide what's the right uses of my labor and what goods and services I want to consume, right? So I make those decisions at a personal level about capital accumulation, about consumption choices, so on and so forth. Smith argues that this idea of this invisible hand will actually result in an optimal social choice. In other words, if everybody makes those choices as they would, we'll have the socially desired level of economic growth. We'll have the socially desired rate of capital accumulation. And it may not be the fastest we could accumulate capital at, it may not be the most economic growth we can get, and it's probably not the least either. But it's based upon the choices that we made. And so the invisible hand idea is the idea that everybody acting according to their own self-interest produces a certain socially optimal output. And therefore there's no need to redirect resources towards more productive ends or whatever, because if you just let people do as they would, you'll come to the result that people want. Okay, so it's pretty powerful, right? Because it says if you just let things be, it'll turn out reasonably well. And honestly, for a lot of things in life, that's pretty good policy. Not everything, but a lot of things. And you may say, well, what things not, right? Okay, we'll actually talk about those in just a second. Okay, this is one of the other super famous quotes by Smith here, the one at the bottom of the page, and sort of the illustration of this invisible man concept. And then on the other panel here, the right hand, is a comic from Tom Tomorrow. And so the hand is the invisible hand, right? So, I don't know, I'm laughing because I think they're really funny. This one is about this is about a not funny situation, which Tom Tomorrow cartoons usually are, about the water situation in Flint, Michigan. And sort of that the invisible hand does not seem to be making drinking water in Flint, Michigan clean. But there you have it. Okay. So I promised you a couple things, right? I promised you we'd put it all together, right? And so we put this stuff all together, and Smith's sort of thing is you kind of let it be, right? Laissez-faire, let it be, and people will choose what they want. And in periods of time where they desire more economic growth, more resources will be directed into these productive categories. More resources will be directed into investment type expenditures. And conversely, in periods where people desire less economic growth, the opposite will happen. Fewer resources will be directed into these investment categories and more into consumption style categories, or in Smithian terms, more resources into non-productive labor and out of productive labor. And that produces sort of an optimal pattern of economic growth in the sense that it reflects consumer preferences. Now, the second thing I promised you is sort of, what are the caveats here, right? Well, Smith has a lot of those, right? Smith also recognizes that there's a lot more to this story than is presented here. And so Smith is clearly talking about, Smith is explicitly talking about economic organization. He is not talking about social organization. He's not talking about social institutions. He's talking about economic institutions. What do I mean by that? Okay, let's be clear. Economic institutions dealing with production and consumption. Social institutions dealing with everything else. So, for example, questions of getting married or not getting married, having kids, whether you should attend church, what religion you should be, what the organization of the family should look like, whether there should be families. These are all social questions, social organization. And for those questions, Smith wrote another whole giant book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's good. You should read it. It was initially published in 1759. We simply don't have time to give it due course here. So instead, what I'm going to do in these final few minutes of this lecture is talk a little bit about what Smith does touch on in The Wealth of Nations. And give you two things. Well, let's do three. Okay, so one, Smith talks about the division of labor and how it's likely to make people very dull, and he uses the word stupid. So you do the same thing every day. You know that thing really good, but maybe you don't know anything else at all. And so Smith points to two remedies. Three remedies, which actually lead to most of the other points, right? First, advocates for public education. Right, so this is 1700s, right? This is a long time. This is before public education was common, right? This is okay. You gotta sort of have people get educated, and you kind of need to require them to do that, because otherwise you're going to end up with a bunch of dummies who only know how to do one thing, right? And that is going to break down over time, right? At some point, that system is going to break. The second thing he points to is you need to have some kind of well-structured religion, right? Doesn't say explicitly, talks about it should not be a state religion, right? But you have to have some sort of religious structure in order to keep society sort of on an even keel, that it continues to value mutuality, continues to value other people as human beings, and respect them as human beings. And if it's not a form of religion, you need to have something like that, right? And then the third thing he points to is that you need some kind of legal structure and enforcement to keep all this stuff working properly, and that really can't be provided by the markets. So you need some kind of government to provide some kind of legal system, as well as the enforcement of those laws, as well as the maintenance of basic things like property rights, which would include some kind of provision. With Smith, he talks quite explicitly about military, and actually says the government should make military stuff. Or if not, they should buy the military stuff domestically. So it's not something that the market should handle. The market should not handle the military, sort of the anti-Milton Friedman there in that. And this is discussed, all the things I just mentioned now are discussed in The Wealth of Nations. You're thinking, like, really? Smith talks about how you have to have religion and wealth? Yes. Okay, really? Smith has Smith has dozens of pages in The Wealth of Nations on education. Remember, he's a teacher. So he has a lot of thoughts about that. So that's the kind of guy Smith was, sort of. It's not sort of you would not put him in the Rand Paul camp today. Where you'd put him politically, I'm not quite sure. I think he'd be somewhere across kind of the two major political parties, as well as some of the more fringe parties. Not really solidly in one camp of any of them, but certainly not within the sort of, let's say, basic libertarian front. That's not where Smith is. Anyway, I've gone on far too long in this video, but I really love Adam Smith. I don't love Adam Smith. I love his work, right? I love his writing. I think he's just a really good thinker. And I hope that maybe I've imparted a little of that on you, and I hope that you'll make the choice to pick up and read Smith. Just for notation, this lecture, this fourth part, for part 4 of lecture 2, this is primarily from book 2 of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, whereas the first 3 parts are from book 1. Okay, so if you're thinking, like, where is this? This is book 2, Wealth of Nations. All right, We'll leave it there. See you next time. Take care, everybody.